This video focuses on converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages. The first thing that you need to remember when converting between the three is that they all have one thing in common, and that is one number, and that number is 100. Now, when I talk about fractions being linked to decimals, being linked to percentages based around this one number, which is 100, it doesn't mean that they are in exactly the same format. So for example, the fractions, the easiest way to remember it is to have a denominator of 100. The decimals, if you take 100 to be the final or the core number and then add the decimal point just there, and the percentages, the maximum that we're going to be working with is 100%. Okay, so I've got a few questions here which I'm going to go through, and hopefully that will explain to you the way of converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages. Okay, so I'll cut these questions down so I do them in chunks. Let's start off with this one. Going back to the rule of 100, if this 1.00 represents 100, then 0.13 would actually represent 13, and that would actually mean that this is 13%. I said that the fraction's denominator would actually be 100. So if we now try to convert this decimal into a fraction, we look at the place value. So if we look at the first place value after the decimal place, this is actually a tenth, and this is the second one, which is 3, is actually the hundredths. So together they make 13 hundredths. So that's how you would get the fraction. Okay, now we can do the same thing for this second question here, 0.5. Now 0.5 is actually the same as 0.50, and that, when you look at it as a percentage, if we just take the last two digits, and that would be 50%. Considering that the fraction is always over 100, if we take 50 over 100, that would be equivalent, but we are always supposed to simplify it. So if we simplify this fraction, that would actually give us 5 tenths, and ultimately if we carried on going, we would get 1/2. So the final answer is 1/2. Okay, this time we're going from fraction to decimal to percentage. Now the issue with this fraction here is that it has a denominator of 4. So we actually need to make that fraction bigger until we get a denominator of 100. So what we could do is write the denominator like I've just done there as 100, and then see what we need to do to 4 to get to 100. So 80% as a decimal would actually be 0.8. You could actually write it as 0.80 as well, but it's more appropriate to have it as 0.8. Now writing that as a fraction would mean that it's 80 over 100, and then we can simplify that down to 8 over 10, and then further simplify that down to 4 over 5. So our final answer would be 4/5. Okay, the next one, 11 over 100. Well, that's already given to us, but 11 over 100 actually means 11 divided by that actually means 11 divided by 100, which when you work it out will give us an answer of 0.14. 0.11. Change that into a percentage. It is a case of being 11%. Okay, this question here, 13 over 20. As we can see, the denominator is not 100, so we are going to multiply it until we get to 100, and 20 multiplied by 5 would make 100, so we also need to multiply the numerator by 5. So 13 multiplied by 5, a bit of mental maths, 5 times by 10 is 50, 3 times by 5 is 15, add 50 and 15 together, you get 65. So that is 65 over 100. Like I said, 65 over 100 is actually 65 divided by 100, which would give us an answer of 0.65. Converting that decimal to a percentage is simply 65%. Moving on to the last few questions, we've got 75%. Convert that to a decimal would give us 0.75. As a fraction, that would be 75 over 100, which can then be simplified down, and when you do simplify that to its final form, it actually ends up being 3/4. Okay, second to last question, 0.4 to a percentage. That's very straightforward. That's going to be 40%, because there is only one digit after the decimal point, which tells us that that's the tenths. So as you can see, when we multiply it up, that's in the tens position there as well. So this is tenths, this is tens, because the conversion between them is either multiply. So when you're going from decimal to percentage, you multiply it by 100. When you're going from percentage to decimal, you divide by 100. Okay, that decimal converted to a fraction, we would have 40 over 100 if we use the percentage, or we would have 4 over 10, because here it's in the tens, our denominator is only going to be with the 10. We can simplify that to 2/5, so our final answer would be 2/5. And last but not least, 6% would actually, when divided by 100, give us 0.06, and then that as a fraction, because it's not in the tenths column, it's in the hundreds column. That means our fraction would actually stay as something over 100, and in this case would be 6 over 100, which can be simplified to 3 over 50. I know I've not gone through them in an exact order for you to follow, but I've done that in order for you to be able to see whether you understand what I have taught in the last few lessons.